Set your course for the Hoth
Takes podcast.
Welcome to Hoth Takes. I'm Eric Geller.
I'm Grace Seegers.
And I'm Haley Bird-Wilt.
And in this episode, we're looking ahead to the next Star Wars TV show that's going to be coming up on Disney Plus at the end of the month. Andor, a prequel to a prequel, but one that has a lot of potential, I think, to be full of really interesting stories. And as we're going to discuss already, just from what we already know about the show, very different from the Star Wars series that we've seen thus far on Disney Plus, in terms of the format and in terms of how the creators talk about what they're trying to do. We have a lot of places we could start, but when it comes to what we are most hoping to see in Andor, I thought maybe I would turn it over to my co-host to kick us off and pick the top thing that's most exciting to them, and then we can dig in from there. So, Grace, why don't we start with you? What's the number one thing on your wish list for Andor?
First of all, when you said the end of this month, I was like, that's not right. It premieres in September, but then I realized it is indeed September.
Yes, it is.
That just threw me for a real loop for a minute. But I think what I am most hoping to see is the fingerprints of the showrunner, Tony Gilroy, who wrote some really fun movies that I like, notably Michael Clayton, the best George Clooney movie, and the Bourne movies. And I'm really hoping that we get to see the kind of cool, gritty storytelling. And I know that there are always conversations like, why can't we get the Dark Star Wars? And it's because Dark Star Wars is not possible because it is fundamentally for children. So I don't think it can be that dark, but I am certainly hoping that it is kind of has a seriousness to it and is able to take this kind of political thriller genre and put a Star Wars spin on it. And then I would just say secondarily, I am super pumped that it just stars primarily some randos and people we know like Cassian and Mon Mothma, but also just normal people who are completely unrelated to the Skywalkers. And I just think that's neat.
I also am excited for a similar reason, Grace. Almost like Rogue One was sort of had to be contained because of like the timeline that it was set in. This is the same way. Like, you know what happens to Andor. Like they're sort of contained to tell this one story, and it looks like it has grand ambitions as a political thriller, but also maybe more character driven and sort of showing what life is like for, you know, this planet. It's a smaller group of people maybe, which is what I really liked about Rebels. So I don't know, I would like to see, I don't know, a story that's a little more self-contained, maybe not as grandiose as the films.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Grace mentioned Mon Mothma. I think the thing that I'm most looking forward to here is all the politics that we seem to be getting. I forget where I read this, but I think in one of the interviews, I think it was established that this is actually going to be sort of a dual story in this first season where it's really about Cassian, but there's a heavy emphasis in, you know, what you might call the B plot on Mon Mothma and the sort of the political birth of the rebellion. And I am so excited to see that. I mean, I just, you know, lost it at, you know, all those shots of Coruscant and the, you know, the Senate and Mon Mothma in the trailer. So excited to see the focus on her. This is an era that we really just don't have a lot of information about from the political side of things. There was that deleted scene in Revenge of the Sith where the senators go to Palpatine and ask him to give up his emergency powers. That was cut from the movie, but even just that tantalizing glimpse at, you know, the beginnings of activism and resistance in this era was fantastic. And I'm so excited to see what seems to be a real focus on that here. And not just like watching, like, what is the Imperial Senate actually doing at this point? And obviously, you know, watching how Mon Mothma does her thing behind the scenes there and sort of tries to use this power that she has to start being a little bit subversive against Palpatine. But also, I mean, just focusing on Mon as a character, right? I mean, we don't really know anything about her as a person and certainly have not had any time to spend on getting a sense of the personal toll that this this task of fomenting a rebellion has taken on her. We really know very little about her as a person, and I'm excited to see kind of that the behind the scenes of her mission, and what it really means for somebody to take on this work. And I wanted to ask you both about this because there was an interview that she did with Screen Rants, and she was talking about Mon Mothma. She was talking about basically where do we find her in the show. And sorry, when I say she, I should say Genevieve O'Reilly, the actress who plays Mon Mothma. And there's a quote here that fascinated me from the interview, and I'm just going to read it. And she said, she's describing, what this person is that we're going to see in the show. And she says, I have even more admiration and respect for the character than I did before, once we've been able to excavate her and see what her life is really like, what it was like to be a senator and to be married from the age of 16, how you've had to navigate the Imperial construct, and what that means to your life and choices. How free are you, and how difficult is it as a woman to have a voice in that environment? Now that is really interesting to me, both because she brings up the point that there is, I think, we're going to see some sexism in the system. That's not necessarily been something that Star Wars has leaned into. They've definitely, when it comes to prejudices, focused more on kind of human versus non-human. But certainly it hasn't been absent from Star Wars. And I think what Genevieve O'Reilly is saying here is we're going to start to see a little bit more of that in this political environment, and particularly with the Imperial bureaucracy. But also, I'm sorry, Mon Mothma got married at the age of 16? Like that's some new lore. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about Mon Mothma because she's this very sort of calm, serene figure in every appearance that she's made, and almost saint-like, not only in appearance, but in her righteous mission. So when we've seen her in the original Star Wars, in Clone Wars, in Rebels, I think she shows up for a hot second, in Rogue One, there's just this very one-noteness to her character, and I think it'll be really interesting to delve into those questions about who she actually is as a person. I'm not sure if I really trust Star Wars to handle a sexism in politics plotline well, but hey, I am willing to be surprised.
How about child marriage, though? That famously uncontroversial topic of child marriage.
Yeah, that's weird. What's up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of joked earlier, that's pretty interesting, but I think it's a little bit weird, and I would like to know what. Clearly, they made a choice here for a reason, and I would like to know the backstory.
Eric, that's not in a book anywhere?
No, this is new.
She
this
just
is all
dropped
new.
new information in an interview.
I'm just like she got married. It's there's something going on, and also she's from Chandrilla. That's canon. They brought that over from the books and stuff. And at Chandrilla, like Alderaan, is kind of one of those sort of idealistic planets where everything is just kind of good and everybody's kind of morally on the right page. And it's it's not the kind of planet where you would expect that kind of problematic, forcing somebody into marriage at, when they're a child. I would not have expected that. And so I'm very curious to know what's going on here.
Yeah, I just went to Mon Mothma's Wikipedia page, and I'm just control effing married. I'm not seeing it.
I found one. His Wikipedia page is literally titled Mon Mothma's husband. And it's got a male individual was the husband of Imperial Senator Mon Mothma. And it's just the interview. That's
perfect.
The only note.
That's my favorite thing about Wikipedia was when somebody has in a book or something, it'll be so and so's dad had always taught them to be brave, and then the Wikipedia page would be so and so's dad, and it'll be a male individual was the father of so and so. At one point, they told their daughter to be brave, and it just cites to that one line in the book. It's okay, I guess I don't know that we needed this page, but okay.
I'm interested that they didn't include the information. The only source on this is the interview that you're talking about, and I'm interested they didn't mention the very early aspect of that marriage.
Yeah, listen, I'll be interested to see where they go with it. But yeah, I mean, I think overall, look, I'm a huge fan of Mon Mothma. I'm a huge fan of the politics of Star Wars. I love that we are going to get to delve into with that kind of Tony Gilroy mindset. What does it mean to take this on as your life's mission? What does that do to a person? So I'm very excited about that.
I just wanted to point out, because I kind of got down a rabbit hole, that there are two mentions of husband, the word husband, in Mon Mothma's Wikipedia page, and neither of them refer to her husband. They refer to Breha talking about her husband, Bail Organa, and Leia about her husband, Han Solo. So there is really nothing in here to indicate that Mon Mothma got married at 16. So if that is a real thing and that was a casual lore drop, that'll be a fun plot line to unravel.
Yes. So we've kind of gotten started here talking about Mon Mothma, which is a little bit my doing of kind of pulling us in that direction. But hey, I mean, the show's about Cassian Andor. It's supposed to give us a sense of what brings him up to the man that we meet in Rogue One. What does a person do in their life that basically turns them into that kind of war veteran? And as we know in the movie, he says, "I've been in this fight since I was." Oh, what does he say? 16? He definitely mentions a very young age. I will be really interested to see what they do with him in the show. How do they turn him into the character of Rogue One? I mean, do either of you have thoughts on this sort of the challenges or the opportunities of stepping back in someone's life and telling a story with a defined, end point in mind?
I mean, I think it will be good. There's just like this series of books I've been reading by an author, and it's like a unique a way of storytelling where it's basically like a historian is telling you what happened, which like introduces a degree of ambiguity about the events, but it also like makes for these moments where it's like, I don't know, takes you out of it and to see the big picture of and that was a moment that he would always remember, and it like casually drops lines like that. And this will be a TV show, so you don't have the same effect, but I have really enjoyed that. Like, people die, that's what happens to people, and I feel like knowing hints of what happens later, or even just the full picture of what happens later, can contribute to a story in a way that when it's, I mean, sometimes it's just meandering and aimless, and but this sort of forces them to be very intentional about it.
First of all, before I continue along that excellent train of thought, Haley, what books are you reading?
It's okay. They're not like a defined series of books. I've just been reading all of this guy's books. His name is Guy Gavriel Kay. He's a Canadian author. Have you read any of his stuff?
I haven't.
I've heard of him.
Good.
I haven't read his books.
It's so good. No, I'll send you my favorite ones, but some of them are like just so, I feel like he spent so much time thinking about like researching a historical era in different countries, and just is very like you can tell that he just has been steeped in it for years by the time he comes to write the book. And so when you finish it, it's like, I feel like I just learned a lot about this, moment in time. Some of it's like a fictionalized version of real events, and I don't know. It's great writing. I really enjoy it.
All right. That's very good to know. It's going on my list. But to continue with that really good point that you raised, Haley, the trickiness in doing a prequel series, and particularly for a character whose life ends in a sort of bittersweet tragedy, is that we know how it's going to end. And so how do you make the characters worth caring about when we know what's coming? And I think that this show is lucky in that it has a very good, interesting main character in Cassian, who really is an interesting character in Rogue One, and I think there's a lot of unplumbed depths to him, so I'm glad that we're getting the opportunity to learn about him. But I do think that is a difficult task to tell a story when the outcome, not only for the galaxy at large, but for the character himself, is a given. And so I'm really interested to see what they do to help us get invested in the character, invested in the worlds, to really make us feel the stakes of this moment, even knowing that there will be a happy ending and a sad ending and more happy and sad endings, because that's life. I think it'll just be really interesting to see whether they can make this that kind of effective prequel series.
We have talked about some of the characters we're really looking forward to, and we'll come back to some characters that we're going to see and some characters that we might see. But I think another thing that's really great about the show is it allows us to really step back and explore not just individual stories, but the broader context, the time period, the setting, right? Grace, you mentioned earlier, this is going to talk about how the galaxy and the war are affecting real people, regular people, not the Jedi and the political and military leaders of the galaxy, but regular people. One thing that is, to me, really exciting about the show is that it's going to be not just 6 episodes, it's going to be 12 episodes in each season. And by the way, each season, because they've already committed to us at least to a second season, it's going to be 2 seasons. Longtime Hoth Takes listeners will know that one of my biggest complaints about Disney Star Wars is that they do, a show with 6 episodes, 8 episodes, between kind of 33 and 40 minutes per episode. And it's like, guys, you could be doing a lot more. You certainly have the money. You don't have to limit yourself like this. I'm so excited that, I think probably with some pressure from Tony Gilroy, they have decided to not limit themselves like that and actually go to a 12 episode season, which still not quite what I would choose. But, if you asked me, I would say 100 episodes, right? I don't think as a Star Wars fan, you're ever going to be satisfied, but I would have pushed for 16. 12 is good enough. We're going to have a lot of space, though, is my point. A lot of breathing room to get into things that they probably didn't have time to do on The Mandalorian, even if they wanted to, which they didn't, right? To dwell a little bit more on some of the nuances that might have been a little bit too minute for a show like Book of Boba Fett or The Mandalorian. Do either of you want to weigh in on this idea of focusing on the regular people of the galaxy and also, almost a study of the galaxy at this point in time, not just individual stories, but a look at the structures that are at work here in a time period that we have not seen explored in this level of detail?
So I don't have that much to say about this, but I will say I look forward to, one thing I enjoyed about Rebels was you got to see sort of the, grassroots groundswell of opposition to the Empire growing. And, it's not just, Luke who was able to do this. It was, there was a whole rebellion behind that. And, I don't know, just from the trailer, it seems like that will be very much a theme of this in the same way. And I saw some people online who were like, maybe we'll get to hear Ezra's, message that he sent out from the Imperial station. And it's like, that would be great. But I don't know. I'm just excited for, the same, I don't know, time period and sort of vibe as Rebels, but maybe I'm assuming too much because it could always be slightly different. But no, I just it's an exciting period in the I guess that's why they keep coming back to it.
Yeah, everyone knows here on Hoth Takes that we are all big Rebels stans. So I'm hoping that does capture, as Haley said, that vibe of sort of real people, a ragtag crew, tackling issues that may be on a smaller scale, but are still critical. And I think something that I'm really interested to see is whether the show brings in characters that are like Mole Man from Kenobi. Remember the
Mole Man
truck driver? Yeah, the mole truck driver who was like, actually, the Empire is good.
Yeah.
So I want to see if there's a diversity in the kinds of people, regular people that we're seeing, because we're going to see the oppressive regime of the Empire, how it crushes the ordinary man down, ordinary person / alien down. But are we going to see people who get into the Empire and support the Empire for legitimate reasons according to their world and their worldview? And then the only other thing I'll add, and I guess this is more of a reiteration, is that I'm super psyched to see Cassian as the main character, to see Diego Luna, who is a great actor, get to do more with that character. And specifically, he is, as far as we know, unless he's secretly the son of Palpatine or whatever, he's a normal dude. And even Jyn in Rogue One, she was the daughter of this famous scientist who was raised by a rebel leader. Cassian's just some guy who took matters into his own hands, and I'm really excited to see that play out, assuming he is not the long-lost cousin of the Mandalorian.
I mean, for all we know, he is Mon Mothma's secret son, that she had at a very young age. I mean, don't give Kathleen Kennedy any ideas here, Grace. The other thing I thought I would mention when it comes to, like, what are the kinds of people that we see get the spotlight in Andor? There was an interview that Tony Gilroy did where he talked about how they wanted to put that spotlight on people beyond, as he put it, the royal family of Star Wars. And he described a few categories of people that they wanted to showcase on Andor. And he actually mentioned journalists. There's a quote from him where he said, there's a billion other beings in the galaxy. There's plumbers and cosmeticians, journalists. What are their lives like? The revolution is affecting them just as much as anybody else.
What?
And, to me, sitting here doing the Hoth Takes podcast, I'm thinking, we're going to get to see some representation on this show.
This
I mean,
is
we're going to
exciting.
get to see journalists. I think on a serious note, if we're going to be seeing the Senate and like political activity, it makes sense that we're probably also going to see some people who are transmitting that activity to the broader galaxy. That could be one setting where we see some journalists. We could also see war correspondents theoretically. It could also be as simple as, journalists, reporting on economic conditions on a planet and how those conditions are tied to the Empire either being there or not being there. Grace, you mentioned this idea that there are some people who actually support the Empire, and some of the reasons actually might be completely legitimate. If you think about economic opportunities, if you think about, the classic example that they always bring up is like fighting pirates. So there might be some, news reporting about, the Empire swept in and got rid of the pirates in our sector. There's all kinds of opportunities to show that kind of like, how are the things that are happening and that we know are happening because we watch Rogue One, how are they being depicted and broadcast to regular people? And how are regular people consuming information about the things that we know through various shades of good and evil? What shades do they use to process those events? So I think it's going to be really interesting. He also, referenced the idea that they might be. It was kind of a strange quote. I'm not going to read it directly, but we'll have the link in our show notes. But he said something that made it sound like they might be creating in-universe TV shows, which again would fit with that idea of wanting to show how these events are being depicted to other people, not just depicting them to us as the viewer. And so, could be some maybe some HoloNet news programming on the show. I think that would be very interesting.
Well, I'm very excited for the prospect of journalists in Star Wars, as previously discussed in our episode with the great Dan Diamond, but color me skeptical that we're going to see actual journalists. I think that our profession is one that is often done dirty by Hollywood and movies and TV, and not very accurate portrayals of what we do or our moral compasses. So I would expect that if we see journalists, it'll either be as a device for standard news breaking, like look at the great thing the Empire did, or as
state broadcasters.
Exactly, state broadcasters, or as propagandists. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one of the characters will be the great journalist working with Mon Mothma to uncover the secrets of Order 66, who then gets mysteriously murdered. That'd be dope. I hope that's it, but I sincerely doubt it.
Well, I have faith in Tony Gilroy to, really give us some representation of journalists. I want to see, what do they do after work? Do they go back to their, to their condo, in the
Smoke
Capital
death
District?
Sticks.
No. Speaking of bad impressions and hackneyed plot devices, we don't want the journalists to be drug addicts. We don't want that. Although, that does make me think, what's Elon Sleazebagano up to? I mean, he could still be alive at this point in the timeline. I would love to see a cutaway much like they had in Book of Boba Fett, they showed the Bomar monk, outside Jabba's palace to remind you of that moment in Return of the Jedi. I would love to see a scene that opens on Coruscant. They push in on the exterior of a club, and he's just out there telling people why death sticks are bad. He's like still, preaching against death sticks. Everybody needs to go home and rethink their lives. Listen to me. I used to be like you.
Maybe he was an undercover journalist writing about the perils of death sticks.
Oh, and he got pulled in too far, and then Obi-Wan was able to rescue him.
Yep.
Or he was so obvious, and his name is so obvious, he may have been an undercover cop, like just a narc with that name.
Nobody would suspect you. That's right. Oh, of the Connecticut sleazebagonos? So we've talked a little bit about the setting and the characters, but I think if we could just kind of go deeper, one of the other things that Andor really has the potential to do is address some of these weightier political questions in a more extended format. Something that, Rebels tried to do, Rogue One, I think, would have wanted to do, but didn't really have the space. And then nothing else has really touched on it. But, it's this idea of, as Diego Luna himself has talked about, what does it mean to be an insurgent? And what does it mean to push for insurgency, revolution? I mean, we have in the real world, obviously, hallowed examples of that in the U.S. We treat the founding fathers like gods because of the fight that they waged against the government that had become oppressive in their eyes. But then there are other situations where we look at people who are fighting against the government, who are trying to undermine political stability, and we condemn them, right? And there are sort of classic examples that you could draw on. But I think it's really interesting that Disney wants to take on this idea of insurgency. And if Diego Luna is to be believed, they're really going to go at it head on. It's not just going to be in the background. They're going to try to grapple with these issues of when is it time to just kind of blow everything up? I mean, does the Tree of Liberty need to be watered with blood, to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, from time to time in order to have a system that actually works for people? I think that's very interesting, especially right now. We're not we said we would not get into real world politics here on Hoth Takes, but suffice it to say, there are going to be some real world themes that are going to resonate with people as they're watching the show.
Yeah, I hope that Diego Luna is right and that it goes into the nature of insurgency and even the concept of domestic terrorism, although that's a very tricky subject to handle well. See, it's just my skepticism is that this is very nuanced, and I don't know if Star Wars can do it. I mean, I love Tony Gilroy, I love Diego Luna, I want him to be right. But I'm just worried that it may be a bit defanged. And arguably, there's nothing wrong with Star Wars, which again is generally fundamentally for children being a bit defanged. But I don't know. I hope that layer of seriousness, that layer of nuance is included. But I guess, as with all things Star Wars, my hope is shaded with skepticism.
Haley, what do you think?
I don't know. I just fear that, everything gets tainted by the poison of our current culture wars. And, like the Lord of the Rings show, the CNN article about that, it was just the dumbest news story I've seen.
Oh, where they were saying that people didn't like that the elves weren't white. The elves weren't white.
Anyway, that was I don't know. To the extent I'm worried about the fact that they're taking that on, I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, how is this? Because when you watch the trailer, there does seem to be an emphasis on marginalized communities standing up for themselves, which I'm sure a certain segment of the population will decide is wokeism in some way. So I don't know. I do worry that this many Star Wars things will become culture flashpoint that it doesn't really need to be. So but I don't know. I think Grace. I do think there was a plot line where Ezra and I think it was a couple other. I don't know if it's Chopper or someone else was with Saw Gerrera. And they sort of did have this debate about insurgency and do we approach this like at all costs, and we're sort of, setting aside the cost of people's lives to achieve our goals, or are we, how do we go about this in an ethical way? And that's a kid's show, but I still remember the feeling that they handled it very well. And it's nice to have, I saw he's in the trailer, so I'm sure he'll be in, the show, but to have that sort of foil to compare with, and sort of like to almost draw some of the characters in, or to see, how far are you willing to go, and like that ethical debate that the characters have to have. I don't know. I don't think they can't do it. I just, like, more so than like, can they pull it off, or will it be meaningful? I'm just worried that the show itself will become like this ridiculous talking point argument between everyone that it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, I think that's a genuinely a good point. And as we have talked about before, Star Wars fandom can be so toxic. And look at the abuse that has gotten heaped on John Boyega, on Kelly Marie Tran, on Moses Ingram. Star Wars fans, a particular subset of them, have a tendency to go the racist route. And I think that you're right, Haley, in this charged atmosphere, everything becomes a cultural flashpoint. And that's so frustrating because sometimes, sometimes things have underlying messages that are really important to get across, and it shouldn't be considered a political talking point for either side, but it is. And I think that's a legitimate worry, that people will just dismiss this show as woke or whatever.
And to be clear on that point,
yeah.
Like, Star Wars has always been political in a way, so I'm not saying like, oh, they shouldn't tackle politics. Like, George Lucas is like Richard Nixon, and like he's clearly has people in mind when he was writing the prequels and the original films, and like that's great, that's art. What I'm worried about is like what people on the right wing are doing to the Lord of the Rings show, which is, oh, there's people of color in this, which means it's like leftist propaganda, and it's like that's the most ridiculous. I don't know. I fear a similar stupidity with this.
No, I got you, and I'm with you.
Especially because, as Diego Luna also said, this is going to be, a refugee story. I mean, this is going to be about a person who was kind of adrift and unmoored in a lot of ways, and had to figure out his identity based on, having to run away and having to try to find a home amid, upheaval, turmoil. That's also a very relevant thing for the real world. And there is unfortunately a partisan political element to conversations about refugees and about migration and about what we owe to people who come here or who go anywhere else, from another place. So I think, that's another opportunity for, this to become a talking point about wokeism, is they're going to take that on as a topic. So listen, personally, I'm here for it. I love it. If it's done well, if it's, I will say this about a political theme or a non-political theme, make it matter and make it relevant. Don't just shoehorn it in. Star Wars has, I think, in general, done a pretty good job of trying to find space to discuss politics and have those allegories without really hitting you over the head with it. Certainly some people will always describe it that way. I don't think that has been a problem for the most part, but I'm looking forward to seeing what Tony Gilroy does with it. So yeah, I'm excited about that. Now, maybe we could talk about something a little bit lighter and less controversial, which is character cameos. We know there's going to be some on the show. As Haley mentioned, we're going to see Saw Gerrera. I'll be interested to see if they portray him in any different of a light from Rogue One or from Rebels. I don't quite know what would be different about him at this point, 5 years before Rogue One, but look for him to show up. But there could be others. There could definitely be others. And before we, get into this, I want to just lay down my marker now. I am predicting, this is an Eric Geller Hot Takes prediction, that we are going to see Bail Organa and Emperor Palpatine, two big ones. I'm predicting it. When they both showed up in Obi-Wan, I was like, okay, like clearly, you know, they're both down to do this if it's meaningful. You know, seeing Jimmy Smits there playing opposite Ewan McGregor was great because of, you know, they had that brief interaction in Revenge of the Sith, but you didn't really get a sense of, you know, how they interacted. I think this offers even more of an opportunity for that because we know that Bail and Mon worked very closely together in the Senate. They didn't always see eye to eye on everything. I would love to see that get some treatment. I would love to see an exploration of where they differ and where they disagree and how they are able to work together ultimately to try to start this proto-rebellion. So I would love to see Bail Organa show up. Palpatine, you know, I would love to see him show up too, but I think he works well in the kind of the Obi-Wan role, which is like he is the guy on the hologram, you know, used sparsely to remind the viewer that he's there orchestrating things in the background. Maybe he could have a bigger role in the show. The great thing about Palpatine is by this point in the timeline, he is so already, you know, ravaged by the dark side that it doesn't matter that Ian McDiarmid himself is so much older. So I think they could actually have him in the flesh, and I would love to see some scenes of him, you know, kind of the other side of this token of the rebellion. I'd love to see scenes of him working against and maybe having some awareness of these secret plans that Mon thinks she's keeping secret, and he's aware of them somehow. Maybe, you know, Masameda, you know, could show up, and they could have some conversations about, you know, Palpatine dispatching him to sort of meddle with the resistance senators. I mean, I think there's so many great opportunities here for both of them, but I would love to hear what you think about them and other characters that you think we might see or that you just want to see.
Well, I think for me personally, I would like to see K2SO, who is the droid that's kind of like Cassian's wingman in Rogue One, because he, as voiced by Alan Tudyk, is a great character. And even if it's just like a very last episode final scene, like, hey, this is the droid K2SO, and they're like, what's up? That hopefully would be more coherent than that. But I would love that. Any Rogue One characters, specifically Chirrut, who is the Jedi guy who says, "I am one with the Force is with me," and he's cool as hell. That would be dope. But really, what I would really love, and Haley, you hinted to this before, would be to see some glimmer of Rebels characters. I don't care how. It could be Ezra's recording there. It could be, you know, just a glimpse of the back of Hera's head. I would be pumped.
I want the Rebels characters to show up, but they're like still their animated versions in the real life world.
Oh, so it's like Who Framed Roger Rabbit? That would be that would be bold, honestly. Honestly, Tony Gilroy, if you're listening, season 2, I'm just saying, you have an opportunity. So first of all, that would be incredible to see Rebels characters. When you said the back of Hera's head, Grace, I thought maybe you were referring to the clip of her in the teaser for Ahsoka that they showed at Celebration, because we do see the back of her head in there, and that got a huge cheer. I don't know if that's leaked online anywhere, but
it has, yes.
Okay, yeah. So listen, I think there are opportunities. We know that they've already been filming these characters for Ahsoka. It seems like there's a chance to have them, you know, show up in Andor. Again, you know, Tony Gilroy in that same interview, he said, you know, any characters that you already know who show up in this show, they're going to be there for a reason. It's never just going to be fan service. The quote from him in the interview was, "It's never cynical. It's always meant to be there. It's always protein. It's never icing." So he clearly wants to make it matter and make it count. I don't think that precludes them from showing up, because I think they are, by this point in the timeline, sufficiently important to this growing movement that they can be present in a scene somehow, even if it's not set on Lothal, for example, right? I mean, I think I would not rule this out, and I think it would be fantastic, a great way to connect these two universes without having it happen on the Ahsoka show, where we already have mixed feelings, as everybody knows, about, you know, the existence of that show. So I am on Rebels character watch for sure. But, you know, since you did mention K2SO, I did just want to say Tony Gilroy has said that he's not going to be in season 1 just because of how the timing works out, but he did sort of strongly hint that at some point you're going to see him in season 2. So
Nice.
there is, I hope that they get Alan Tudyk for that again.
Yeah, the thing is for this show is that everything I read about it, every trailer I watch makes it like I'm really excited for it. And I want it to be what Tony Gilroy and Diego Luna are saying. I want it to be a refugee story. I want it to be a political thriller. I want to see the tension between Saw Gerrera and Mon Mothma's various styles of insurgency. I want to see cameos, and I want to see journalists in Star Wars. And everything that I'm reading just makes me more and more excited for this show. And in the immortal words of Admiral Akbar, I just feel like it's a trap. I
But
love
it looks so gorgeous.
It does look so good. But I've been burned before.
That's true, but let me just say this. I never felt like this for Book of Boba Fett, right?
That's true.
And I was going to say I never felt like this for Rise of Skywalker, although watching the first trailer for that movie at Celebration with Ian McDiarmid coming out on stage was a hype moment, and the trailer did look cool. And back then we all thought that maybe Palpatine would be present in some spirit form or hologram form. We didn't know that he was going to come back to life. So yes, I did kind of feel this way for Rise of Skywalker, but very early on, and I don't think it's comparable. All I'm saying is I don't think there's really been a Star Wars project that has gotten us this hyped with this many people saying this many things that sound good, only for it to play out completely the opposite way. I just don't, the worst Star Wars in recent memory has been Book of Boba Fett, and I don't think that I don't think it got us this hyped, and I don't think that it got people in general this hyped unless they were Boba Fett fans specifically. So I think that we can be cautiously optimistic here. I take your point, Grace, that it's certainly suspicious that the Death Star, is unfinished and Palpatine just happens to be showing up right when we get the intelligence about it. But I think that the shield will be down when we get there, and I think that we should start our attack run.
Heyo.
So, just to kind of spin back over to something that you mentioned, you said at the top that, Tony Gilroy has this great pedigree for telling great stories, doing, political thrillers. Michael Clayton was a fantastic movie. I have not seen the Bourne movies, but I know that they are, widely regarded as being very, very good. I'm excited that he's on this project, and I think what excites me most is that he's not a Star Wars fan. He's not somebody who comes into this treating Star Wars as precious. And I think, ironically, sometimes if you come in with that perspective, you end up making some of the mistakes that get the fans mad at you, just because you're overthinking certain things. I mean, I think J.J. Abrams is a classic example. I enjoyed The Force Awakens, but I think Rogue One. I think The Rise of Skywalker was an example of some of the problems that you run into if you come into this from the insider's perspective. An outsider is a great breath of fresh air to have on Star Wars. I'm glad that Bob Iger and Kathy Kennedy and who's the new Bob Iger? Well, Alan Horn at the Walt Disney Studios, whoever the new CEO is at Disney. I'm glad that all of them got together and said Tony Gilroy can be on board, because it could be considered a brave choice or risky choice. But listen, I think it's exactly what Star Wars needs right now. And Grace, you put in our show notes this quote from him from one of the interviews that he did, where he said, "You should be able to watch the show and not give a bleep about Star Wars ever, or have ever seen any Star Wars." That is great to hear, because it means that he's not going to rely on the tropes that some of the Star Wars storytellers have relied on, where, wink, wink, hey, look, it's the guy from The Thing. Remember that? I think I'm getting a strong sense from him that is not something that he would tolerate from the creative team on the show. So I'm excited. I'm glad that he's going to be here. And as you said, Star Wars is primarily for kids, but that doesn't mean you can't do something a little different or have a little bit of nuance that you might not have put in a different story. I think this is an opportunity to really get into the muck of war and revolution and migration and in a way that we haven't seen before. So I am, in Tony Gilroy, I trust.
Yeah, I have to look this up. You see, the "We Believe Michael Clayton" sign That it's like, in this house, we believe that Michael Clayton is. Wait, I got it. We believe the legal thriller Michael Clayton, starring George Clooney, Tilda Swinton, and Tom Wilkinson, is a vastly underrated cinematic masterpiece and easily one of the 5 best films of the 21st century.
That's a bold claim.
It is. I don't think I'd go that far. Top 5. But I do think it is underrated. And the first 3 Bourne movies are great. So I do have high hopes. And the other thing that made me think of you, Eric, was that I believe this wasn't filmed as much on the volume.
Oh, yes.
Which is,
Yes. Okay, no, go ahead, and then I'll pick it up.
No, I was just going to explain what the volume is, as if our listeners don't know what the volume is, but it's that digital set that, they put and make that. I'm being incoherent. Eric, describe the volume for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big soundstage with wraparound digital screens so that they can project like the desert sun or like the hyperspace swirl, and like you get actual realistic lighting effects on characters' faces and skin, and it allows them to they build a small set and they have digital set extension behind the actors, and they can turn the screen perspective as the camera is turning so that you get realistic like parallax effects and all that. It's a cool technology, but as Hoth Takes listeners know, I have been very critical of all the shows so far for being constrained by the need to film almost everything on the volume. I think, everybody pretty much considers that Boba Fett episode of Mandalorian as one of the best live-action Star Wars TV episodes so far, and it's no coincidence that they filmed that on location. They actually went out to a real place and filmed there, and they were able to move around more. You had sort of a broader scope of physical movement and storytelling. And Tony Gilroy has said, we physically couldn't film this on the volume. It was too limiting. We had too big of a scope in mind. Several of the actors have talked about how they actually built a full-size city set for one of the cities that's in the show where they could walk around anywhere and film. It's like Galaxy's Edge in that sense. When they were building Galaxy's Edge at Disney World, they all talked about how, you never do Star Wars this way. It's always built to be filmed. We needed to build something that you could walk around in. They did that for this show so that they could film anywhere in this city. And I'm just so excited about that. I'm so happy that they are not constraining themselves to this shiny bauble that they have built for themselves and that they want to use as much as possible. And again, I think that partly comes down to Tony Gilroy saying, this is my vision, and it's great that you guys have this cool thing that you've been using, but I don't want to do it that way. I like to tell stories in real environments. So I'm so pumped about that.
Yeah, I want to hear more of Haley's thoughts about just everything in general, but specifically the volume.
Okay, so you know very well that I like the best episode of The Mandalorian was when they were like out in the desert, which I think Eric mentioned, and they had like the boulders and they were fighting and Boba Fett showed up, and it was great because they weren't in the sort of self-contained thing, and obviously a huge problem, major flaw in the Book of Boba Fett was like it felt like nobody was there. It was just a very it was like a ghost town. So I don't know, it didn't feel very realistic, but I don't know, I have very high hopes, like Eric sort of said, just based on, the footage we saw in the trailer and some of the stuff they've said publicly about the work that went into it. And you can't just blame it on like a lack of like vision for the other directors. Like the pandemic complicated a lot of things, and like partly why it forced them to do a lot of the filming in the volume. And But I'm excited to see something bigger scale for sure.
Yes, I should say, in all fairness to folks like Deborah Chow and Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, they obviously were dealing with constraints that I think for the most part Tony Gilroy probably did not have to deal with, or at least as much. So yes, that's a very good point. By the way, speaking of Tony Gilroy, I know it's been a love fest for him here on the Hoth Takes podcast, but I just have to read one more quote from an interview that he did. He was talking about the time period of Andor and the sort of the idea that, does it matter that it's a prequel and that we all know how everything's going to work out with Cassian? And he said, we're all living in a prequel. We're all going to die, which I just is such a great, I don't know, just very, very funny. I think that he has just a very refreshing attitude. Like again, it's not precious to him. He's a storyteller, and he'll do a Star Wars story if it's a good story, but he's not doing it because he watched Star Wars when he was 8 and it, changed his world. So I'm excited to see what he does with Andor, and I think both of you, it sounds like both of you are too.
That is a great quote. It reminds me of something that my mom says a lot, which is no one gets out of here alive. So I respect.
Wow. God, that's dark.
I mean, the original story of the first, well, not the first time she said it because she says it a lot, but one of the times she said it was around a bunch of chickens that were later on going to be, killed to become meat. And a bunch of the kids that she was with were horrified by that, and she just looked into the distance and said, no one gets out of here alive. And it's truly iconic of her, and also iconic of Tony Gilroy.
All right, well, thank you for joining us for our look ahead at what we hope to see from Andor. The series premieres on September 21st with the first 3 episodes of the show, so look for that, and we will be back here to talk about all things Andor as soon as that comes out. If you want to share your thoughts about this episode of Hoth Takes or suggest topics for future shows, you can email us at hothtakes@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at HothTakes. I'm Eric Geller on Twitter. Grace is Grace_Seegers, and Haley is Birdinator. Haley made our wonderful logo and banner art, and I edited the show and put together our music. And as always, for legal purposes, we do want to point out all Star Wars themes and sound effects are the intellectual property of Lucasfilm. You can find a complete archive of past episodes on our website, hothtakes.wordpress.com. And hey, if you like the show, share it with a friend. You can find Hoth Takes on all the major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. We'll see you next time. May the Force be with you.